The room stopped. Not gradually, not in a wave, all at once, like a switch had been thrown. 300 fighters, coaches, promoters, and journalists in a Washington, D.C. convention hall, and not one of them made a sound. Because Joe Louis had just said a name, and then he had said a place, and then he had said a time. And the man's whose name he'd said was sitting 12 feet away in the same room, listening to every word. Nobody breathed, nobody moved. The overhead fluorescents hummed. A chair scraped somewhere in the back of the hall. That was the only sound for 6 full seconds. Then Chuck Norris set down his coffee cup, and the room understood that something had just begun that wouldn't end with words. To understand what Joe Louis did that afternoon in Washington, D.C., you first need to understand what Joe Louis was. Not what he claimed to be, what he actually was. Because the gap between those two things was smaller than it was for most men who talked as loudly as he did, and that made him more dangerous. Joe Louis was, by any serious accounting, one of the 3 or 4 greatest American karate competitors of the 1960s and 1970s. Full stop, no asterisk. The man had won the United States Karate Championship in 1966. He had won it again. He had fought across the full circuit, East Coast, West Coast, regional, national, and he had, in the language that fighters use when they mean the real thing, taken his share of the best men available. He was 6 feet tall, 210 pounds, with the striking mechanics of a man who had spent years in Okinawa studying under masters who didn't differentiate between sport karate and the thing you did when somebody was trying to kill you. He had trained with Bruce Lee, not briefly, not casually, but seriously, over time, with the kind of dedication that produced actual change in his game. He was, in short, legitimately terrifying, and he knew it. That was the part that created problems. Joe Louis carried his reputation the way certain men carry a loaded weapon, always visible, always accessible, always slightly pointed at whoever was in the room with him. He didn't announce his credentials the way insecure men do. He didn't need to. He simply let them exist at a volume that made it difficult for anyone else to exist at the same volume. He had opinions about other fighters, specific, public, unasked-for opinions, the kind that circulated through the karate circuit the way rumors circulate in small towns, quickly, inaccurately, and with a life of their own that outlasted any attempt to correct them. His opinion of Chuck Norris had been building for months. It started as a technical assessment. He thought Norris's tournament style was too conservative, too reliant on timing and positioning, rather than raw power application. Good enough for sport, not sufficient, in Louis's view, for what he called, in the specific loaded phrase that fighters of his era used, the real world. The technical assessment was probably not entirely wrong. That's what made the public version of it so corrosive. Because what began as a technical argument had become, by the time the Washington, D.C. convention assembled, something personal.
Here's the number that matters. Chuck Norris held 6 consecutive world middleweight karate championship titles. 6. Joe Louis had 1. The man questioning Chuck Norris's toughness had a fraction of Chuck Norris's competitive record, and he'd spent months saying it in public rooms. The convention was the annual National Karate Instructors Conference, a gathering of school owners, coaches, and senior competitors from across the country, important people. People whose opinions shaped where the sport went. People who remembered what was said in rooms like this. Chuck Norris was there because he ran schools across California, and the circuit expected his presence. He was the reigning world champion. His opinion on the direction of American karate instruction mattered to the people in that room. Joe Louis was there because he was Joe Louis. That was sufficient. The morning session had been uneventful. Curriculum discussions, standardization debates, the dry but necessary business of a sport trying to organize itself into something durable. The afternoon session began to shift. A panel discussion had been convened, the question of how sport karate related to practical self-defense. It was a real debate. Both sides had legitimate arguments. Joe Louis was not interested in a debate. He was interested in making a specific point about a specific person in a specific room where that person was present. He began with the technical argument. Tournament karate, he said, produced fighters who were conditioned to stop techniques, to pull punches, to function within a rule set that had nothing to do with what happened when a man with no knowledge of sport karate put his hands on you in a parking lot at 2 a.m. The room agreed, generally. This was not controversial. Then he said the name. Chuck Norris, Joe Louis said, would never survive a real street fight. He let it sit. He wasn't done. His whole game is built on timing, on points, on stopping at contact. He paused. That's not fighting. That's dancing with rules, and I can show anyone in this room the difference. Another pause. Chuck, name the place, name the time. 300 people. Every face in the room rotated toward the same point, the table near the center left where Chuck Norris was seated with a legal pad and a cup of coffee that was going cold. Norris had been looking at his legal pad when Louis started speaking. He had kept looking at it through the technical portion of the argument. He was not performing disinterest. He was genuinely taking notes, the kind of engaged attention that a man brings to professional content he considers useful. When his name was first said, he looked up, not sharply, just up, the natural movement of a man whose name has been spoken. He listened to the rest of it without expression. When Louis said, "Name the place, name the time," Norris did not immediately respond. He looked at Louis for a moment, long enough for everyone in the room to understand that he had heard it, processed it, and was making a choice about what came next. Then he looked back at his legal pad. He wrote something. The room watched him write it. Nobody could see what it was. He finished writing, capped his pen, and set it beside the legal pad.
Then he looked at Joe Louis, and he said one sentence. Nobody present could agree afterward on the exact words. The substance was consistent across every account. It was a confirmation, a date, a place, delivered in the same tone a man uses to confirm a lunch reservation. No anger, no theater, no performance of acceptance, just, yes, here, this time. The moderator later said that the temperature in the room dropped approximately 5 degrees when Chuck Norris spoke. He didn't mean it literally. He meant that the specific kind of ambient social warmth that exists when people feel safe in a room, the warmth of informal familiarity, of professional context, had left completely. What remained was something older, more serious, the kind of air that exists between two men who have just made an agreement that both of them intend to honor. Joe Louis nodded, one nod, satisfied. Chuck Norris picked up his coffee cup and took a sip. The panel moderator called a break. The break had been called for 15 minutes. It ran 40. The 40 minutes happened because about 60 people had quietly followed Chuck Norris and Joe Louis out of the convention hall and into the parking structure 2 buildings away, the kind of following that happens without being announced, where everyone knows where they're going and nobody talks about it. No officials, no judges, no rule set discussed or agreed upon. Just a concrete parking structure in Washington, D.C. at 3:40 in the afternoon with 60 witnesses arranged in a rough circle under fluorescent parking deck lights and 2 men in the center who were about to have the conversation that Joe Louis had publicly scheduled and Chuck Norris had quietly confirmed. Louis had shed his conference jacket. He was in shirt sleeves, a dress shirt rolled to the elbow. At 210 pounds and 6 feet, in a space with nowhere to retreat, the physics of the situation seemed to favor him visibly. Norris had not changed anything. Same conference clothes. He had not rolled up his sleeves. His posture was the same as it had been in the convention hall. 60 people. Nobody was talking. The parking structure lights hummed. Somewhere above, a car moved through the upper level. its tires squealing on the painted concrete. The sound faded. Then silence. Then Joe Louis moved. He came fast. Joe Louis was not a slow fighter. Nobody who'd seen his tournament record thought he was slow, but those who saw him in that parking structure described a different kind of speed than they'd seen in competition. Not the controlled, point-scoring speed of a tournament fighter pulling contact, but the committed, full-weight speed of a man who has decided this ends now. He opened with a front kick, sharp, direct, intended to set range. Any other opponent in that space would have been reset by it. It didn't land. Louis adjusted immediately. He was good enough to adjust. A left jab, probing for the new position. Nothing.
Norris had already moved again. Small movements, each one minimal, each one removing exactly the right amount of space from the attack's geometry. The 60 witnesses described it independently in almost identical language. It looked like trying to catch water. 3 exchanges, 4. The pace was fast and genuine. Nobody was managing contact. Nobody was pulling anything. This was as real as the version Joe Louis had been describing to rooms full of people for months. And Norris was not there for any of it. At the 5th exchange, or possibly the 6th, the witnesses disagreed on the count. Louis committed to a combination, a jab cross sequence with his full body weight behind the cross. It was a serious technique, the kind of thing that ends conversations. Norris slipped the jab. He was inside the cross before it fully extended. 2 things happened so close together that witnesses disagreed on the order. A short right hand to Louis's ribs, controlled, not full power, but precisely placed at the precise moment of maximum vulnerability in the cross's overextension, and simultaneously, or just after, a knee, redirected, guided rather than driven into Louis's thigh, not injuring, not intended to injure, intended to communicate. The communication was, I have been inside your guard 3 times in the last 2 seconds. I have chosen not to close this. That is my choice, not yours. Joe Louis went back, not down, not stumbling, a controlled step backward, the automatic trained adjustment of a fighter re-establishing range. But he went back, and in the 3 seconds after that, nothing in the parking structure moved. The silence lasted longer than any sound should. Then Louis put both hands up, not surrender, not defeat, the gesture fighters use when they're acknowledging a point, the open palm gesture that says, stop, I've received the information. He looked at Norris. Norris looked back. In that look, nobody reported. Nobody felt qualified to describe it because they hadn't been inside it. The 60 witnesses saw 2 men look at each other for about 4 seconds. Then Louis lowered his hands. He said something, short. The witnesses near the front heard a word or 2. The ones farther back heard nothing. Norris nodded once, and that was the conversation.
The 60 people who walked back into the convention hall walked back differently than they'd walked out. That's the detail that the 300 people who'd stayed behind noticed first, not what the 60 said. The 60 said almost nothing, at least not immediately. It was the way they came through the door, the specific quality of people who had witnessed something and are still processing it. The afternoon session resumed. It was shorter than scheduled. Joe Louis did not say anything further about Chuck Norris's fighting ability. He contributed to 2 other panel discussions on tournament structure and on the question of weapons training, and he was substantive and informed in both. He did not revisit the earlier subject. He never revisited it publicly again. Chuck Norris returned to his table. He picked up his legal pad. He uncapped his pen. He continued taking notes. Within a week, it had reached every major karate school on the East Coast. Within a month, a version of it had crossed to the West Coast circuit. The story changed in the telling, as all stories do. The number of witnesses grew, the techniques described became more elaborate, the duration extended in some versions, compressed in others. But the core of every version was the same. Joe Louis had said Chuck Norris couldn't fight. Then he'd said where and when. And then that conversation had happened. And after it happened, Joe Louis never said that thing about Chuck Norris again. That specific detail, Joe Louis's subsequent silence, was what gave the story its weight. Because Joe Louis was not a man who went quiet easily. His opinions were a matter of public record. His willingness to state them loudly and in company was well documented. His silence on this specific subject was therefore not nothing. It was everything. And the people who heard the story through the circuit, the coaches, the competitors, the school owners, the students, heard the silence as loudly as they heard the story. The promoter who'd been moderating the panel that afternoon, the man who'd called the break, ran tournaments across the Mid-Atlantic for 15 more years after that day. He told the story at the edge of the mat, in the back rooms of convention centers, at the dinners that followed regional championships. He always told it the same way. He always ended it the same way. Joe Louis walked out of that parking structure understanding something he didn't understand when he walked in, and Chuck Norris walked out of it the same man he walked in as. That's the whole story. That's all of it.
He remained one of the most respected fighters on the American circuit through the early 70s. He won. He trained seriously. He continued to work with Bruce Lee. He contributed genuinely to the development of American martial arts. His influence on full-contact karate was real and lasting. He also, notably, had a different relationship with public statements about other fighters after 1970. Not a silent one. Joe Louis never became a quiet man, but the specific register of certainty he'd brought to statements about Chuck Norris, the absolute public confidence that another man's ability was inadequate, that register disappeared. People who knew him well noticed. Some asked about it. He didn't explain it. He didn't need to. Chuck Norris, for his part, did what Chuck Norris consistently did. Nothing in public. No statement, no confirmation, no reference to the Washington, D.C. afternoon in any interview, any book, any press appearance across the following decades. This, too, was noted by the circuit, because the circuit understood that the men who had the most to say about what they were capable of were almost never the men who were the most capable, and the men who said least were almost never the least dangerous. The circuit had just received a vivid demonstration of that principle. It filed the demonstration under the appropriate heading and moved on. There is something in the martial arts tradition, in the Japanese concept of mushin, the Chinese idea of wu wei, that describes the state of a fighter who is moved beyond the need to perform capability, who is trained so deeply that the gap between thought and action has closed, whose response to attack is not a decision but an event, as natural and unconsidered as a reflex. That state is not achieved by talent. It is not achieved quickly. It is achieved through years, sometimes decades, of repetitions so complete that the technique stops being a technique and becomes, simply, the way the body responds to the world. Chuck Norris had been training since 1958. By 1970, he had 12 years of that accumulation in his body. 12 years of daily practice, competition, instruction, correction, failure, and revision. 6 consecutive world championships won against men who came specifically to take them. Thousands of sparring sessions, hundreds of tournament matches. When Joe Louis came at him in that parking structure, he was not fighting a man who was thinking about what to do. He was encountering 12 years of answered questions. And 12 years of answered questions is not something you can overcome with one very loud public statement, or 60. Here is the thing about Joe Louis that the circuit respected. He went in. He didn't back down. He made the statement, named the place and time, and then walked into that parking structure and meant it. He was not posturing when he challenged Chuck Norris. He genuinely believed what he had said in that convention hall, and he was willing to test it. That takes something. In a world full of men who made claims and then found reasons not to honor them, Joe Louis was the man who showed up. He just showed up to the wrong answer. And what Chuck Norris demonstrated in that parking structure was not that Joe Louis was wrong about his ability. He was demonstrating that Joe Louis was wrong about his, wrong about the depth of it, wrong about what 12 years of serious competition actually produced,
Wrong about the assumption that tournament training was a limitation rather than a foundation, that the precision and timing and positional mastery of world-class sport karate was insufficient rather than, in the hands of the right man, sufficient. It was more than sufficient. 300 people were in that convention hall. 60 walked to the parking structure. One man walked out of it understanding something he hadn't understood when the morning began. He named the place. He named the time. He walked through the door, and on the other side of it, he found the answer to the question he'd been asking publicly for months. It just wasn't the answer he expected. The parking structure still stands. The 60 witnesses scattered across the country. The story traveled the circuit for 15 years without appearing in print, because the true ones always move that way, quietly, persistently, underneath everything, like the foundation of something that was never going to fall.